The Ferrari 488 Pista sliced through Manhattan's rain-slicked streets like a crimson bullet. Behind the wheel, Alexander Chen checked his Patek Philippe watch for the third time in 5 minutes 9:47 p.m. The board meeting had run late, as usual. Not that it mattered, time was just another commodity he'd learned to bend to his will, much like everything else in his life. Lightning crackled across the sky, illuminating the sleek interior of the $350,000 vehicle. At 32, Alex had amassed what most people couldn't in 10 lifetimes, an $8.2 billion fortune, a tech empire that made headlines weekly, and a reputation that struck fear into competitors' hearts. They called him the Tech Titan of Terror, a nickname he secretly enjoyed. His phone buzzed again. Another message from his executive team about tomorrow's acquisition. Some startup had developed an AI algorithm that could predict consumer behavior with unprecedented accuracy. Their asking price was ridiculous, barely 8 figures. Alex smiled. By this time tomorrow, that algorithm would be his, and the startup's founders would be signing ironclad non-compete agreements. The rain intensified, drums of water hammering against the Ferrari's carbon fiber hood. Through the windshield, New York's lights blurred into streaks of neon, like digital brushstrokes across a canvas of night. Alex pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the engine's response like an extension of his own heartbeat. A flash of memory, his father's voice, stern and disappointed. Success requires sacrifice, Alexander. You can't afford to be soft. The old man had been right about that, at least. Every billion in Alex's empire was built on tough decisions, on knowing when to be ruthless. The traffic light ahead turned yellow. On any other night, he would have slowed down. But tonight, fresh from crushing another competitor in the boardroom, Alex felt invincible. He pushed the Ferrari faster, aiming to beat the red. He didn't see the puddle until it was too late. The world spun in a kaleidoscope of lights and shadows. Alex caught fragmented images, raindrops suspended in air like crystal beads, the city skyline rotating impossibly, the steering wheel jerking out of his hands. The Ferrari's tires lost their grip, and physics took over with cruel indifference to his net worth. Time slowed. In that eternal moment before impact, memories flickered through his mind, like a malfunctioning video feed signing his first $1 million contract, the day his company went public, his mother's tears when he told her business was business and sold her house for development. The last thing Alexander Chen saw was his own reflection in the guardrail, eyes wide with the sudden realization that some things couldn't be bought or controlled. Then darkness. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythm of a heart monitor pulled him from the void. His eyes felt heavy, reluctant to open. The air smelled of antiseptic and fresh linen. Hospital. He must be in a hospital. When he finally managed to lift his eyelids, a concerned face swam into view, a doctor in a white coat, holding a penlight. "Can you tell me your name?" the doctor asked gently. He opened his mouth to respond, then froze. Panic rose in his chest like ice water. I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know who I am." The nurse had left an iPad on his bedside table, and that's how he first met himself. Alexander Chen, CEO of Neurotech Solutions, stared back at him from countless news articles and photos. The face in the mirror matched the one on the screen, but everything else felt like reading about a stranger. "Tech's most ruthless CEO strikes again," one headline blared. He scrolled through the article, his heart sinking with each paragraph. 500 employees laid off via automated email on Christmas Eve. A competing startup bankrupted through aggressive patent litigation. Former partners describing him as brilliant but soulless. "That can't be me," he whispered to the empty room. But the evidence was overwhelming. His Instagram feed showed a life of calculated perfection: designer suits, private jets, yacht parties. Not a single genuine smile in any of the photos. His Twitter timeline read like a masterclass in corporate intimidation, each tweet more arrogant than the last. A soft knock interrupted his spiral of discovery. "Good morning. Time to check your vitals." He looked up to see a young woman in purple scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Unlike the other hospital staff, she wasn't consulting his chart or looking at him with barely concealed recognition. "I'm Sarah," she said, adjusting his IV with gentle efficiency. "I volunteer here 3 days a week. How are you feeling?" "Like I'm reading someone else's biography," he admitted. Apparently, I'm horrible. Sarah paused, studying him with warm brown eyes. You know, memory loss is interesting. It strips away everything except who you really are at your core. The person I've been talking to for the past 10 minutes doesn't seem horrible at all. He managed a weak smile. You're the first person who's treated me normally since I woke up. The nurses either fawn over me or act like I might fire them on the spot. Well, I can't be fired if I'm not getting paid, Sarah laughed. Besides, right now you're just another patient who needs help. The rest is just noise. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. 3 men in expensive suits burst into the room, led by a silver-haired gentleman whose scowl seemed permanently etched into his features. Alexander, thank God you're awake. We need to discuss the company immediately. The man barely spared Sarah a glance. Nurse, please leave us. She's not. Alex started to correct him, but Sarah was already slipping out with an understanding smile. I'm Gerald Matthews, your KOR, the man continued. The board is meeting in an hour to discuss temporary leadership arrangements. Your condition presents significant challenges. Alex felt a headache building behind his eyes. I don't even know what our company does. We're 3 weeks away from launching NeuroMap, the most advanced consumer behavior prediction system ever created. The press release is ready, investors are lined up. And I'm supposed to lead this launch. How exactly? Alex interrupted. I can't remember my own phone password. Gerald's expression hardened. The board is concerned that your memory loss might be convenient. The timing with all these recent regulatory inquiries. But are you suggesting I faked a near-fatal car crash? We're suggesting you take a temporary leave of absence. Voluntary, of course. With full benefits. Gerald's tone made it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. Alex looked down at the iPad, at a photo of himself from just last week. The man in the image was smirking at the camera, standing in front of a mission accomplished banner after a successful hostile takeover. That Alexander Chen would have destroyed anyone who dared suggest he step down. But that wasn't who he was anymore. Or maybe, as Sarah had suggested, this was who he'd been all along, underneath the empire and ego. I need time to think, he said quietly. Gerald nodded curtly. The board meets again tomorrow at noon. We'll need your decision by then. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Alexander, I hope you recover quickly. The company needs the old you back. After they left, Alex stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there was his penthouse apartment, his office, his life. All belonging to a version of himself he wasn't sure he wanted to remember. Sarah returned a few minutes later with a cup of tea. Thought you might need this after that circus. Thanks, he accepted the cup gratefully. Can I ask you something? If you read about someone who'd done terrible things, but then they completely forgot who they were, are they still responsible for those actions? Sarah considered this as she adjusted his pillows. I think the more important question is, what will they do now that they know? 3 days after the board's ultimatum, Alex stood in his penthouse apartment for the first time since the accident. Sarah had offered to help him navigate this homecoming, claiming her volunteer shift had conveniently ended. They both knew it wasn't true, but he was grateful for the company. This place looks like a museum, Sarah remarked, running her finger along a pristine marble countertop. Does anyone actually live here? Alex wandered through the space, searching for any emotional connection to his surroundings. The apartment was all chrome, glass, and calculated minimalism. No photos, no photos, no personal touches, just expensive emptiness. According to my housekeeper's notes, I spent most nights at the office, he said. Apparently, I only came here to sleep and change suits. His home office yielded more insights. Sarah helped him sort through documents, and each discovery painted a darker picture of Neurotech's operations. Internal memos revealed the company had buried studies showing their algorithms reinforced harmful biases. Draft patents described plans to collect user data without consent. Look at this, Sarah said, holding up a thick folder. Letters from former employees. Your assistant marked them low priority, no response required. Alex began reading. Each letter told a similar story: dedicated workers discarded for maximum profit. A software engineer who'd been with the company from the start, laid off 2 weeks before his stock options vested. A pregnant project manager terminated for performance issues after requesting medical leave. "I need some air," he said abruptly, dropping the letters. Sarah drove him to his childhood neighborhood in Queens, following an address they'd found in his records. The modest row houses were a far cry from his Manhattan penthouse. "This can't be right," Alex muttered as they parked. But then he saw her, an elderly Asian woman tending to potted plants on a small porch. Something deep inside him recognized her instantly. "But, Mom." She turned, her gardening trowel clattering to the ground. Alexander, her accent was thick with emotion. "What are you doing here?" I had an accident. I lost my memory," he swallowed hard. "But I'm trying to understand who I am, who I was." His mother's eyes filled with tears. "Come inside, both of you." The house was small but warm, filled with photos Alex didn't remember. He saw himself as a smiling child, as a proud high school graduate, as a young man in a startup t-shirt. In every image before a certain point, his eyes held a light that was missing from his more recent photos. "You were such a kind boy," his mother said, "serving tea in chipped cups, always helping neighbors with their computer problems, teaching seniors at the community center how to use email. Your father, what about him?" "He was hard man, brilliant businessman, but hard. When he died, you were in college. You promised you wouldn't become like him." She looked down at her tea. "But then came the investors, the pressure. Each time you visited, you were different. Colder. The last time I saw you was 2 years ago," she continued. "You said you were building something important, something that would change the world. You needed to buy the house for a development project. I asked for time to say goodbye to our home of 30 years. You said business couldn't wait." Alex felt sick. "What did I do?" "You paid above market value. Very generous," the realtor said. "But money wasn't what I wanted from my son." Sarah, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Something changed you. When was the turning point?" His mother retrieved a newspaper clipping from a drawer. It showed a younger Alex at a tech conference, standing next to a distinguished-looking man. "Marcus Chen," she explained. "No relation, but when he took interest in your startup, you were so proud. He became your mentor, taught you what he called the real rules of business." Alex studied the photo. He remembered nothing of Marcus, but he recognized the hungry look in his younger self's eyes. Marcus said I reminded him of himself. He read from the article. He said nice guys finish last in tech, and he was going to teach me how to finish first. After that, everything was about winning, his mother said softly. "You said you were becoming stronger. I said you were becoming someone else." They left as sunset painted the neighborhood in shades of amber. Alex was quiet during the drive back to Manhattan, lost in thoughts of the person he used to be and the person he'd chosen to become. "I understand now," he finally said. "I didn't lose my soul overnight. I traded it away, piece by piece, thinking I was growing stronger." Sarah glanced at him. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Gerald. The Neuromap launch was being accelerated. Full board meeting in the morning. Alex stared at the message, thinking about algorithms that manipulated people, about employees treated like disposable assets, about a mother's garden he'd tried to pave over in the name of progress. "I know exactly what I'm going to do," he said. "But I'll need your help." Sarah smiled. "Good thing I've got some vacation days saved up." As they drove toward the city lights, Alex realized that losing his memory hadn't erased who he was, it had revealed who he could be. Alex stared at the test results on his computer screen, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the data for the 5th time. There was no denying it, the AI-powered medical diagnostic system was dangerously flawed. The false negative rate was nearly 30% in certain populations, meaning thousands of patients could go undiagnosed if Meditech released it as planned next month. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk himself, and Sarah at last week's charity gala, both smiling. The memory felt hollow now. Just 3 hours ago, she'd revealed her true identity. Sarah Chen, investigative reporter for the Digital Chronicle, not the healthcare consultant she'd claimed to be. The past 6 months of their relationship had been part of her investigation into Meditech's practices. "You were never going to tell me," were you, her words still echoed in his mind. "About the corners you cut in development, the rushed trials, the suppressed early warning signs." The familiar burn of defensive anger rose in his throat, but it felt different now. weaker. Because she was right, he had known. He'd just gotten so good at looking the other way, at justifying things in the name of innovation and progress. Just like he had at his previous company, before the scandal that had forced him out, before he'd promised himself he'd do better this time. The boardroom was silent as Alex finished presenting his findings. CEO Richard Matthews leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "These are concerning numbers, Alex, but we're too far along to delay now. Our investors are expecting a Q2 launch. The market opportunity won't matter when people die," Alex interrupted, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "We're talking about cancer screenings, Richard. Real people's lives. People die from delayed treatment too." Barbara from marketing chimed in. "Our system, even with its current accuracy rate, could still help thousands who don't have access to specialists." Alex had used that same rationalization himself countless times. It was seductive in its logic, in the way it transformed ethical compromises into noble sacrifices for the greater good. But now he saw it for what it was, a way to avoid making the hard choice, the right choice. "I've already sent the full test results to the FDA," he said quietly. The room erupted. Richard's face turned purple. "You did what? Without board approval? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes," Alex replied, standing up. "What I should have done months ago." He pulled out his phone and showed them the screen his email to Sarah, containing all the documentation she'd been seeking for her investigation. "And I'm done covering up our mistakes. You'll never work in this industry again," Richard spat. "We'll sue you for breach of contract for what? Preventing you from releasing a product we knew was dangerous." Alex smiled sadly. "Go ahead. I've got copies of every email where we discussed the risks, every meeting note where we decided to push forward anyway. How do you think that will play in court, in the press?" He thought of his younger self, fresh out of college, burning with ambition and conviction that the rules didn't apply to true visionaries. That kid would have seen him now as a traitor, a coward selling out his company for what? A clear conscience? But that kid had been wrong about so many things. Barbara cleared her throat. Maybe we should discuss postponing the launch, running more trials, if Alex's data is accurate." "It is," Alex said firmly. "And I'm not asking for a discussion. I'm telling you what's going to happen. We're going to announce a voluntary delay of the product launch pending additional testing and FDA review. We're going to be transparent about the issues we've found and our plans to address them, or I go public with everything tomorrow morning." Richard's jaw clenched. "You're bluffing. You'd destroy yourself too." "Yes," Alex agreed simply. "I would." The silence stretched out, heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Alex thought of Sarah, not the betrayal he'd felt at learning her true identity, but the disappointment in her eyes when she'd confronted him. The way she'd looked at him like someone who'd lost their way. Finally, Richard nodded curtly. "Draft a press release. Barbara, get legal and PR on this immediately." "Alex," he paused. "You'll submit your resignation after the announcement." "Agreed." Alex gathered his papers. "I'll have it on your desk in an hour." As he walked out of the boardroom for the last time, Alex felt lighter than he had in years. His career in tech was probably over. His reputation would be in tatters. The stock options that were supposed to set him up for life would be worthless. And yet, he pulled out his phone and opened his messages to Sarah. He stared at the blank screen for a long moment before typing, "You were right about me. But I'm trying to be better. If you're still working on your story, I'd like to talk. The real me this time." The reply came almost immediately. "Coffee in 20 minutes. I know a place." Alex smiled as he headed for the elevator. Sometimes the hardest choices were also the simplest ones. Sometimes doing the right thing meant being willing to lose everything you thought you wanted to become someone you never thought you'd be. He was ready to find out who that person might be. The morning Alex's whistleblower testimony went public, his mother's garden chimes woke him instead of his usual phone alerts. He'd been staying in his childhood home for the past week, ever since the media firestorm began. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent so many years running from this place, from who he'd been here, only to find refuge in it now. His phone buzzed another request for comment, this time from TechCrunch. He declined it like all the others. The only interview he'd given was to the Digital Chronicle, speaking with Sarah's colleague instead of her. That story had broken yesterday, laying bare Meditech's rushed trials and suppressed data. The company's stock had plummeted 40% in hours. His mother, stood in the doorway, 2 steaming mugs in hand. She'd aged since his last visit 2 years ago, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Thanks, Mum," he took the mug, breathing in the familiar jasmine scent. "I've been thinking about Dad's accident." She sat beside him on the porch swing. "What do you remember?" "Not much. Still mostly blank. The accident that had taken his father and left Alex with selective amnesia had happened 15 years ago, but lately fragments had started returning. But I remember how I changed after. How angry I was. How I decided that success was the only thing that mattered, because nothing else made sense anymore. And now." Alex watched the steam rise from his mug. "Now I think maybe I've been running from the wrong things. From feeling anything that might slow me down or make me question myself." He glanced at her. "I'm sorry I wasn't here more. That I shut you out." She squeezed his hand. "You're here now." His phone buzzed again, Sarah this time. His heart stuttered as he read her message. "Can we talk? In person?" They met at the small park near his mother's house, the same one where he'd learned to ride a bike 30 years ago. Sarah looked different, somehow softer, without her consultant persona, but also more real. "I killed the story," she said without preamble. Alex blinked. "What? Why? After all those months of investigation?" "Because it's not the story I thought it was anymore." She sat beside him on the bench. "I started investigating Meditech, looking for another tech villain, another powerful man putting profits over people. And I found him." She smiled slightly. "But then he changed. He saved thousands of lives by stopping that launch and exposing the problems. That's the real story." "I'm not a hero," Alex said quietly. "I knew about the problems for months before I did anything. I was part of the system I exposed." "Exactly. That's what makes it powerful. Real change isn't about perfect people doing the right thing, it's about flawed people choosing to be better, even when it costs them everything." She pulled out her reporter's notebook. "So I want to tell that story instead, if you'll let me." Alex stared at the notebook, remembering all the lies between them. But maybe that wasn't the whole truth either. Maybe some real things could grow from artificial beginnings. Like the way Sarah had seen through his carefully constructed facade to the person he could be, even before he saw it himself. "One condition," he said. "We include the whole truth about me. About who I was before, not just who I'm trying to be now." She nodded. "Deal." That evening, sitting with his mother looking through old photo albums, another memory surfaced. His father's voice, clear as day. "It's never too late to start over, Alex. To choose who you want to be." He touched the faded photograph of his father, feeling the truth of those words now in a way his younger self never could have understood. His old memories might never fully return, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the person he was becoming mattered more than the person he'd been. His phone had been quiet for hours. He'd finally turned off notifications after the 100th media request. But one new message caught his eye, from Dr. Chen at Stanford Medical, interested in consulting on ethical AI implementation in healthcare. "Your perspective could be valuable." Alex showed the message to his mother, who smiled. "What are you thinking?" He thought about the past months, about choices and consequences, about the slow, hard work of becoming someone new. "I'm thinking maybe we don't always have to choose between doing good and doing well. Maybe we just have to be brave enough to try." Through the window, he could see Sarah in the garden, apparently charming his mother's cat, despite its notorious distrust of strangers. Some things, it seemed, were meant to change. Others, like the way Sarah's presence made his heart lift, maybe weren't meant to change at all. He typed a quick reply to Dr. Chen, "Let's talk." The garden chimes tinkled in the evening breeze, and Alex felt, for the first time in years, completely present. Not running toward the future or away from the past, but simply here, in this moment, becoming who he was always meant to be. 1 year later, Alex stood at the podium of Stanford's Memorial Auditorium, addressing a room full of tech executives and entrepreneurs. But his non-profit Tech Conscience had just launched its 100th ethics consultation project. "The hardest lesson I learned wasn't about technology," he told the audience. "It was about the stories we tell ourselves to justify our choices. Success isn't measured in stock options or board seats. It's measured in the lives we touch, the harm we prevent, and the truth we're willing to face about ourselves. Sarah sat in the front row, no longer taking notes but watching him with quiet pride. They'd taken things slowly after his whistleblowing, rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honesty this time. She'd helped him launch Tech Conscience, using her investigative skills to identify companies that needed their help most. These days, she wrote about tech ethics for the Chronicle, and they made a point of never mixing their professional and personal lives. After the talk, they drove to the Clifftop Road, where his father's accident had happened 15 years ago. It was his new tradition visiting on the anniversary, not to mourn anymore, but to remember and reflect. "Most of my memories of him are still gone," Alex said, watching the sunset paint the ocean gold. "But I remember how he lived, his integrity. Maybe losing those memories forced me to figure out who I was without them, to choose who I wanted to be." Sarah squeezed his hand. "And who is that?" Alex smiled, thinking of the dozen emails in his inbox from whistleblowers seeking advice, of the young programmer who'd broken down in his office yesterday after preventing a privacy disaster, of his weekly dinners with his mother where they talked about everything and nothing. "Someone who measures wealth differently now," he said. "Someone who knows that second chances aren't about erasing who you were, but about choosing who you become." A gentle breeze carried the salt air up from the ocean, and Alex felt that familiar sense of peace that had slowly replaced his old restless ambition. His bank account might have fewer zeros these days, but his life had never been richer. "Dad would have liked you," he told Sarah, another fragment of memory surfacing his father's laugh, the way he'd always made time to help others despite his busy schedule. "I wish I could have met him," she said softly. "In a way, you have." Alex turned from the sunset, ready to head home. "You helped me become the son he always knew I could be." They walked back to the car hand in hand, leaving the past where it belonged but carrying its lessons forward. The road ahead curved out of sight, but Alex wasn't worried about where it led anymore. He had everything he needed right here: purpose, love, truth, and the courage to keep choosing them every day.